Et donc, on va pouvoir passer à l'intervenant suivant, qui est donc Leonardo Abate, qui va nous parler de chilique italien. Et donc, je vais lui laisser la parole. Leonardo, we can start. So it's up to you now. We're listening to you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Let me just share my slides. Let me know if these are visible.
For the moment, we do not see anything.
Great start. All right, that's weird. There we go.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here. My thanks to the Université Sorbonne Paris Nord and La Rochelle for hosting and organizing this conference, and to my supervisor, Jonathan Lessard, for all the support that he has given me in these years. My name is Leonardo Abate, and I'm an independent PhD student at Concordia University, researching the history of Italian tabletop role-playing games. And I'm here to talk about the very beginnings of role-playing games in the peninsula. In my presentation, Dungeons of the Bel Paese, I will go over the first 2 decades of role-playing games in Italy, years that define the character and style of local RPGs up to the present day. Also, I chose this image for the title because it was the PowerPoint suggestion for Dungeon, and I find that a bit funny. Before venturing into the past, let's begin with a snapshot of the present. In 2021, the Brancalonia Spaghetti Fantasy third-party supplement for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition from publisher Acheron Games got funded on Kickstarter with more than 10 times their initial goal. Also in 2021, the Kickstarter for the English release of Not the End, an award-winning dice-less indie-inspired game from Mana Project Studio, got funded with 6 times its goal. And in 2023, the same studio secured the rights to work on the official Cowboy Bebop role-playing game and funded that project with 20 times its goal. While always within the niche of role-playing game production, these are 3 stories of great commercial success from Italian designers and producers, each showcasing an emblematic side of the Italian role-playing game sphere. A D&D supplement capitalizing on humor and a uniquely Italian aesthetic, a smaller experimental game pushing the limits of traditional game design, and a licensed game based on a popular Japanese anime series. These successes were only possible because of a connection to international audiences and markets, something that would not be achieved in the country before the mid-2010s. And yet, we can find traces of these same styles and interests from the very beginning of Italian role-playing game production, way before commercial success was even thought to be a possibility in the field. So, how did we get here? The history of Italian role-playing games begins in the early 80s. So for comparison, let's quickly recap the situation in the English-speaking world in those same years. As I expect almost everyone here will know, Dungeons & Dragons, the first game recognized as a role-playing game, emerged in the 70s within the wargaming sphere. The quick timeline of events goes something like this. Between 70 and 71, Gary Gygax and Jeff Perrin developed the medieval miniature wargame Chainmail, which contains a fantasy supplement as an appendix. Dave Allison is inspired by the system and utilizes it between 71 and 72 in his notorious Blackmoor campaign, where influential concepts are introduced, like experience points and the use of individual characters rather than armies. This in turn inspires Gygax, which recruits Arneson to develop and publish the first edition of Dungeons & Dragons in 1974, funding the publishing company TSR in the process. Within the fantasy and wargaming hobby circle, the novelty of Dungeons & Dragons immediately begins to spread. The title of second ever role-playing games goes to Empire of the Petal Throne in 1974, which would be republished more professionally by TSR in 75. With the dam now broken, imitators and competitors would soon emerge. The earliest example of the latter also comes in 75 with Tunnels and Trolls, made as an explicit critique and improvement over Dungeons & Dragons' most idiosyncratic features, such as its use of weird dice. Chaosium's RuneQuest, released in 78, would instead be one of the most influential of the many fantasy imitators that would spread by the end of the 70s, on top of incidentally creating the bones for the more renowned Call of Cthulhu system. Also, by the end of the 70s, the hobby had expanded beyond the confines of the fantasy genre, for example with Traveller, the most popular sci-fi role-playing game up to the early 90s, where it would be dethroned by Cyberpunk 2020. When the 80s rolled around, the American role-playing game market was lush with variety and experimentation. The fantasy genre was still dominated by Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, released in 77, and distinct from the original D&D line, which, if you don't know the details, is a long and convoluted story in its own right. And Traveller was still king within sci-fi. Call of Cthulhu, released in 81, was the first successful horror role-playing game, building on top of the popular Lovecraft horror stories, and all kinds of other fiction genres were represented in their own niche. Top Secret in 1980 tackled the spy genre, Champions in 1981 became the new standard for superhero games, and in the late 80s, Japanese properties started to find their own space, such as 1986 Robotech, based on the Macross anime license. This was the environment when role-playing games first began to spread on the shores of Italy, but as we'll soon see, the situation across the pond was wildly different. As a last point of note, before I properly delve into the topic at hand, I want to quickly talk about the methodology I employed in my research. Finding information on the early years of Italian role-playing games is not easy, as documentation is scarce at best and the spread of the hobby was mostly relegated to word of mouth. As such, I had to employ multiple avenues of investigation. Where possible, I used as basis pre-existing literature, most of which are unavailable in languages other than Italian, such as Ghilardi and Salerno's Giochi di Ruolo, which attempts to introduce role-playing games to an inexperienced Italian audience, and Sacco's Mondi Eroici, which was invaluable in its cataloging of every role-playing game released in the country until 2010. Official magazines and fanzines, the ones that I could access at least, were also an invaluable source of information on the interests and attitudes of the time, but the bulk of my sources took the form of interviews with designers and academics that lived through those early years and were able to provide first-hand accounts on how the hobby began and spread, including key events that have been otherwise lost to history. I am very grateful for their time and for the invaluable insight they provided. So, without further ado, let's get into the thick of it. The early 80s in Italy saw a rise in popularity in many hobby spheres, which slowly began to trickle into the mainstream. In 1980, the immensely popular Per Gioco magazine began its release, it being dedicated to smart game for adults, which covered everything from chess to war games, from Rubik cubes to poker. It will host a dedicated role-playing game section from 1982 onwards, but that's getting a bit ahead for now. In 1981, the first board game store in the country, I Giochi dei Grandi, opened in Verona, and in subsequent years would become one of the main publishers of local games. It was clear that times were changing fast, and a couple of releases even heralded the upcoming advent of role-playing games. The games Seven Legio and Magicon in 82 and 83 respectively were competitive board games clearly inspired by foreign role-playing games and acted for many as a gateway to the innovative new medium. As for role-playing games in their own right, it would be a little while longer before the notoriously cautious and traditionalist Italian publishing world would really get on board with the novelty. The first ever mention of role-playing games in the country was in the game-focused booklet A Che Gioco si gioca, published by the local newspaper L'Espresso in 1978, which references them as a frivolous step back from historical war games, which are instead praised for their historical accuracy and cultural relevance. But while big publishing houses were failing to acknowledge the new trend that was sweeping the USA, hobbyist enthusiasts which happened to speak English were carrying them over in an unofficial capacity. A figure of extreme note of the time was the late Agostino Carocci, considered in many ways the father of Italian role-playing games, which in 1980 in Rome funded the small publishing house Fantasy MAM together with Massimo Sensacqua and Massimo Longo, and published the first Italian fanzine La Voce del Drago, practically impossible to find copies of nowadays. Through Fantasy MAM, Carocci starts to spread an apocryphal edition of the original Dungeons & Dragons, informally known as Synopsy, which aims to avoid copyright infringement by presenting it as a simple synopsis of the rules. This would be the first exposure to role-playing games for many Italian hobby enthusiasts, and would be followed by many such unofficial posts of the game and even supplements, such as Angiolino Zenalegi's Blue Book, the only one of these early publications which I could find an image of, containing new original monsters and character classes. Finally, in 1984, we see the two first official releases of role-playing games. Surprisingly enough, both are original games. The order is somewhat disputed, but generally speaking, I Signori del Caos is the one credited as being the very first Italian role-playing games, with Carrocci's original work Catacombas following shortly afterwards. Both could aptly be described with Ron Edwards' terms of fantasy heartbreakers, being very clearly derivative of Dungeons & Dragons, yet with substantial differences between them. I Signori del Caos was a pretty straightforward sword and sorcery dungeon crawler, if with some unique spins on the formula, such as having a definite end state, each character having the goal of maxing out their stats and ascending to godhood. Conversely, while in no way notable for its mechanics, Catacombas presented a highly original setting inspired by Italian folklore and an overtly comedic tone, poking fun at the self-seriousness of American fantasy literature. Of the two, the latter would prove the most influential in the long term, capitalizing on uniquely Italian trappings rather than simply emulating the foreign style. And then, finally, in 1985, the first official translation of Dungeons & Dragons first edition is released in the country by the Editori Giochi publishing house. Remembers fondly as La Scatola Rossa, or the Red Box, this would be a huge watershed moment for the local community and the beginning of the end for the extremely provincial and homemade character that the hobby had had for the past 5 years. An official translation and expansion of Dungeons & Dragons would be reduced considerably as official supplements and adventures enter the market, and slowly but surely, both local production and foreign imports would begin to ramp up. Still, the remainder of the 80s would not be very prolific. In the 5 years following the release of the Red Box, only 6 new games would see release in the country. In 1986, an Italian translation of the most popular fantasy game in Germany, whose original name I can't pronounce but translated in English to The Dark Eye, was released to modest local success. In 1987, an original detective game called Holmes & Company is released, which utilized original mechanics to simulate all kinds of mystery novel subgenres, from the classics of Agatha Christie and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle to more gritty and modern hard-boiled detective stories. 1988 sees the local release of Tunnels and Trolls, and finally 1990 is when local production begins to really find its stride, with localization of Call of Cthulhu first and foremost, and the release of 2 original games, the post-apocalyptic Figli dell'Olocausto, and the historically meticulous fantasy conspiracy games I Cavalieri del Tempio, where the players embody supernaturally gifted Knights Templar and influence the course of history from the shadows. But while role-playing games were still extremely niche in the 80s, other much more popular releases would pave the way for the boom that would shortly follow in the 90s, acting as gateways for the new audiences to join the budding hobbyist community. One of these would be the release of the Dragonlance series of novels in 1988 with Dragons of Autumn Twilight, produced by TSR as a tie-in product for D&D, which ironically in Italy would end up being much more popular in the short term than the parent game and make many fantasy fans curious about the game inspired by the books. But the biggest by far would be the Lone Wolf series of Choose Your Own Adventure game books, which starting from 85 would take the Italy by storm and win many local awards. Moving from those books to role-playing games would be a very short step for many local fans. So to summarize the situation of role-playing games in the 80s, firstly and most notably, role-playing games in Italy are still extremely niche and relatively unknown. Only 9 games were published between 1984 and 1990, which is less than the games released on average in a year in the USA during the same period, and many of the most influential titles of the time were still glaringly absent. Communities were small and provincial, focused in the big cities like Rome, Verona, and Milan, and with little opportunity to come in contact with each other, but they were heavily dedicated and surprisingly diverse. Unlike in the USA, where early role-playing games originated mainly in wargaming communities, in Italy early adopters came from a much wider variety of both hobbyist and literary background, including many that started as teenagers or even younger. Lastly, while game production was scarce, local games were highly experimental. Only the first 2 followed the standard fantasy adventure format, while the other 3 focused on much less popular genres and mechanics for the time, and all of them were made without any thought of profitability, but mainly in an attempt to share and expand a hobby that had yet to fully take root in the country. The early 90s is when role-playing games start to really take off and enter the local mainstream, being supported both by fans and, finally, by publishers. 1991 will see the release of the first official magazine dedicated to role-playing games, Chaos, which in each of its numbers would spotlight an important game or genre, the first number being, of course, dedicated to Dungeons & Dragons, showcase smaller local releases, and generally offer a first avenue of contact for the community across the entire country. In that same year, the renowned yearly comic convention Lucca Comics expanded into Lucca Comics and Games to encompass role-playing games, becoming a center of connection for players and publisher that had for the first time the possibility to reliably mingle and share ideas. The age of the provincial game store had come to an end, and a more unified role-playing game scene was starting to emerge. The rate of publication also spiked exponentially, making it impossible to fully cover it in a short amount of time and making the following slide very crowded. Colloque being only the start, many international hits were ported between 1990 and 94, and it was clear that the Italian publishers were now frantically trying to catch up with the international market, releasing both contemporary hits and influential games of the 80s. In short order, the most relevant releases of those early years were The Lord of the Rings role-playing games in 1991, the GURPS Universal System, Cyberpunk 2020, and Vampire the Masquerade in 1992, Star Wars the role-playing games in 1993, and 1994 would finally see the release of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, together with Warhammer, Ars Magica, and Paranoia. While taking a step back to the influx of foreign role-playing games, local production in those same years also saw a considerable spike. 1991 would see the release of the first local license system, Dylan Dog the role-playing game, based on the immensely popular series of horror comics and becoming the first original horror games in the country. 1993 is often remembered as the best year in local role-playing game production, with the release of the fantasy game Druid, but most importantly, of Lex Arcana, an adventure game set in a fantasy alternate history of the Roman Empire and considered by many the best original Italian role-playing games, to the point that it would be re-released worldwide almost unchanged in 2018 in a glossy new edition from Acheron Games, and of L'Orlando Furioso, notable from being an educational game made in collaboration with the municipality of Rome that was supposed to gamify, borrowing a modern term, the study of the Italian classic of the same name. Lastly, 1995 would see the release of Elish, a fantasy game set in an original Italian-inspired setting heavily reminiscent of Catacombas, and On Stage, a diceless theatrical improvisation game inspired by Amber diceless role-playing games, which would ironically never be released in the country. The mid to late 90s will also see a novelty in local role-playing games release, that of manga-inspired original role-playing games. Japanese anime had already found their popularity during the 70s and 80s as children's entertainment, but it was in the 90s that manga comics started to really spread and be understood as a genre fit also for teenagers and adults. Releases such as Akira and Hokuto no Ken in 1990, these last made by Ganata Press, which was also the publisher of the Chaos role-playing game magazine, and of Dragon Ball in 1995, were immensely popular and exploded alongside the rising relevance of role-playing games in the hobbyist mainstream. It is not surprising that original role-playing games overlapping these two interests would begin to emerge, from unofficial adaptation of popular series, such as the Hokuto no Ken role-playing game in 1995 and the Dragon Ball role-playing game in 1999, to games that attempted to capture the aesthetic of Japanese comics without being tied to a specific property, such as the hilariously titled official manga role-playing game in 2000, which had nothing official about it. This interest in Japanese pop media would continue far into the future, making Italy, together with France, one of the most prolific countries in the world when it comes to official and unofficial manga and anime-inspired role-playing games. But it is not a chance that most releases I've referenced so far occur before 1995, as every boom is usually followed by a bust. The late 90s in Italy were a rough time for role-playing games, for a variety of reasons. Firstly, just like in the rest of the world, the release of Magic the Gathering in 1994 began the start of a new boom, that of trading card games, that severely harms the sales of role-playing games in those same hobby spaces. Then, in 1996, Italy experienced its own small satanic panic, thanks to a short-lived media campaign spurred by the now disgraced lawyer Luciano Faraoni, which was capitalizing on the suicide of a teenager erroneously linked to role-playing games, not unlike what had happened in the USA in the early 1980s. But most crucially of all, local publishers were simply losing faith in the profitability of the medium, favoring more stable product lines such as board games, and not really supporting the international spread of local role-playing games in any way, which caused some of the biggest designers at the time, such as Magginetti of Lex Arcana fame, to temporarily switch careers towards something more profitable before later in their careers coming back to role-playing games. This all resulted in role-playing game production to go significantly down in the latter half of the decade, which concluded not with a bang, but with a whimper. So, what are the main takeaways of the situation in the 90s? First off, after the relative obscurity in the 80s, now role-playing games have become an integral part of the mainstream hobby scene. An entire new generation also approached them, brought over through a variety of ancillary means. Fantasy literature, game books, conventions, magazines, even educational programs run in school, universities, and libraries. The simultaneous spread of manga in the country would also heavily influence the same generation and inform local tastes and design sensibilities for years to come. Despite the growing mainstream popularity, local production of games remained heavily experimental and independent, which in the short term was to their commercial detriment, and would mean that many of them would never be translated or ported abroad. Lastly, despite the influx of popular underdog games, some big titles were still completely absent. Traveler would only see an Italian translation in 2009, while games like Champion and shockingly Robotech and similar mech-inspired games would never see a release in the country. This lacks what was present and what was absent would inform the taste and points of reference of local productions, making, for example, sci-fi games extremely rare in the country. But I don't want to end this talk on the lowest point of Italian production. The 90s bust was not an isolated case and followed international trends, and was designed that after its first decade of relative isolation, Italy had now become interconnected with the larger role-playing game community, and for better or worse, would only grow more so in the years to come. Like in the States, the early 2000 D20 boom would revitalize local production and lead to the creation of regional settings and models reminiscent of the more anarchic early 80s, such as 2005 Nefandum's fantasy horror setting. The rise of the Forge and the indie movement would find fertile ground in the already experimental sentiments of local designers, and many of them would join the international internet-based movement. And on the note of internet, the spread of PDF would make self-publishing much more viable and allow designers to reach international audiences directly without having to rely on reticent local publishers. Some lament this development as the loss of the uniquely national and provincial character that the country's role-playing game scenes had maintained during those first 2 decades. Some celebrated them as a chance to finally be a part of the worldwide community that for so many years had only been imported. But in either case, the tale of these developments is a story for another time. Thank you very much. That concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Leonardo. We have time for one question. Nous avons la possibilité de faire poser une question. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions dans la salle? En français, en anglais, je traduirai éventuellement.
I have a question on the more on the practices nowadays in Italy. I'm wondering if there is a kind of emancipation from Dungeons and Dragons or not, like it's seen in many other countries where it still have a huge autonomy. Do you feel like in your modern day practices, the way the role-playing community were shaped make it possible for the new local scenes we told us about in with the PDFs and other forms? Are you still mainly focused on Dungeons and Dragons, or the other titles are still very popular?
You managed to understand?
The audio was a bit spotty. Could you summarize the question? Sorry.
Yeah, what was said is do you think that in fact the majority of the players now are still influenced by Dungeons and Dragons, or does the new format with PDF and other forms of printing have managed in fact to come to the play and people play some other things now?
So the current situation of role-playing games in Italy is generally speaking kind of split between kind of a more mainstream audience, which is still very much follows the Dungeons and Dragons trend, which after the third edition release, the release of the D20 system, and now the popularity of the fifth edition is still very much kind of the main game in the country, even though you have publishers like Acheron Games who tend to do like original settings and supplements for Dungeons and Dragons. But there is also a very prolific, more independent community that is kind of split between the indie game scene that was like heralded by the Forge, and the OSR revolution, the old school revolution. Both of those are very popular within more enthusiast communities. Like the current situation is that Dungeons and Dragons is pretty much mainstream. Like everyone plays Dungeons and Dragons, but fans of role-playing games specifically tend to diversify more, and you have companies like Fumble, GDR, that publish a lot of more independent and more experimental titles. So I'd say that while the spread of PDF, the internet-based things, did not like dethrone D&D as the main one, it still managed to create a lot of very prolific sub-communities that are becoming more and more relevant as time moves on, and even mainstream titles are starting to adopt more indie stylings and themes in their own design. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thanks.
Une autre question?
Thank you very much, Leonardo. We have to kind of go ahead because in fact we're a bit late, but thanks again.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here. Bye.